Hi, I'm Nicola Jennings, one of the co-founders of Athena Art Foundation. This is Athena Asks, a podcast where we talk to artists, curators, historians and collectors about their work, pre-modern art, and the world today. Today I'm delighted to welcome Brown CBE. Glenn is a British artist known for his use of art historical references in his paintings. Glenn's work has been the subject of numerous solo exhibitions, including exhibitions in France, in London, in Vienna, in Cincinnati, in Florence. I could go on. And he's also been part of many group exhibitions, most recently at the National Museum in Stockholm and the Athenaeum Gallery, all in Scandinavia, as well as in the Centre Pompidou Metz and at the Palette House Gallery in Chichester. So let's start with this painting from a recent exhibition, Touch the Flaming Dove. I love the titles of your paintings, by the way, and maybe you could say something about them. What is going on in this painting? To me, it says Caravaggio, dirty feet, and maybe the gnarly feet that you get in Ribera.
I realised that seeing the undersides of somebody's foot in certain cultures is considered very rude. It's a display of the underbelly of the world, something that you're not meant to look at. And they are grotesque feet. They're feet of somebody stepping into the next life, maybe, and hence the stars in the background. They're sort of floating off into the heavens. The title actually comes from a David Bowie song called Soul Love. I don't know what it means. I'm not sure what David Bowie knows what it means, but it's a wonderfully enigmatic title, and I like titles that sort of add another colour to the paintings, as it were. They sort of add further meaning and complexity in a poetic resonance. And the blue, there's lots of references I always use to paintings all over the place. So the blue sort of comes from Picasso's blue period, but the initial image itself is from a Dürer drawing of the feet of a kneeling priest. So they're completely the other way up. And I've elongated them greatly, as well as turning Dürer's lines into what look like brushstrokes in paint. Dürer's drawings are some of the most wonderful things created by mankind, as far as I'm concerned. They're extraordinarily technical advancements in the way we see. And part of that would have been down, actually, to the development of optics, I think, that Dürer, as a German, would have had. He could have used glasses and ways to see things in a greater detail than anyone had been able to see before. Technology enabled Dürer to make etchings and drawings in a way that nobody had been able to before.
And presumably he was very, very sensitive to line, because all his work was about line. Well, he painted as well, obviously, but his most striking works, I think, are his engravings, aren't they? Line is something that you focus on a lot in your works.
Especially in the work I've been making in the last 3 or 4 years. All of my work is based around the brushstroke in some ways. I'm fascinated with other people's expressionist feelings, and maybe my lack of ability to do it has pushed me to copy and transcribe different senses of movement that are held within an arm, and the way that a wrist can swish paint around on the end of a brush. My paintings are absolutely flat and painted over a long period of time. I sort of build up glazes and lines in order to create the look of real brushstrokes, but nothing's quite what it appears to be in my work.
At the same time as being like Dürer's lines, use it to approximate that really knotty use of paint that somebody like Ribera uses to convey kind of gnarliness.
Yes, because of course in a painting like Ribera's, just as in artists like Willem de Kooning and Frank Auerbach later emphasised, that actually the texture of the surface is very important, because you make a three-dimensional brushstroke and it catches the light in a particular way, which emphasises the line and creates certain glistening highlights as the light is reflected off this undulating surface. Whereas in my work, there is no undulating surface. It's all, I paint in the sort of glistening highlights, pretty much as flat as I can get it, as if the paint was glittering in the sort of moonlight in this case. I often relate the idea of snakes and ladders to the way people look at a painting, that your eye moves around the surface. You climb up a ladder and your eye then slides down a snake. That's the way I'm trying to use line to move the viewer's eye around the work in particular ways, and in and out, because they have perspective in them, and therefore your eye moves in and out of the painting too, as well as around it.
Is there a particular reason why you want your works to be so flat?
It's partially post-modernity, really, the idea that things not being what they seem, because In most of the 20th century, the idea of truth to materials and that if a painting should look like a painting and it shouldn't pretend to be anything else other than its true nature. And by the time I was at art college, all that idea of truth to materials was being thrown out the window and artists started playing games, just as they had in the previous 300 or 400 years. So I am being dishonest in many ways. I'm making fake brushstrokes. You could say fake emotions as well, but then again, what is a fake emotion? Is everything an actor does a fake emotion? Well, yes, it is, but we love actors and we love how they present the world to us. So that's in many ways what I'm doing. I'm acting out, making brushstrokes. I'm playing around in a sort of very postmodern, tricky way that's meant to make you laugh and be engaging, as well as tragic and sad.
There is a long tradition, art historical tradition, for using line rather than using thick matter, just in the way that Dürer's drawings or his prints evoked using line, right?
Oh, absolutely, yes. The idea of postmodernity is it was a slight return to the days before modernity had cleaned up what we were supposed to do and think. Literature and photography and sculpture and writing all become mixed with the visual arts, and everything is much more playful. And it doesn't really matter anymore what the materials are that you're using.
Great. Let's move on to the next painting. I'm very curious to know what's going on here. As an art historian, I see two different types of iconography, Christ carrying the cross and a Virgin and Child. And then there's also this amazing frame. So tell me about this work.
Well, yes, it's based on two very small, quite quick drawings done by 17th century painter Murillo. I love his work, and I particularly love his drawings because of the fluidity and the shakiness of the line. His lines are very agitated. A lot of my work is based on drawings. It's a bit like somebody's handwriting. An artist gives an awful lot away through the way they make marks, and just as I do, because my marks are very particular to myself, whether it's a pencil line or a pen line or even a brush making a line, it's a very sensitive thing for an audience to read, I think, to pick up on the nuances of emotion. Even down to the title, it's quite a dark work, this. Cemetery lifestyles, what is that? Somebody who lives in a cemetery, or is it the idea of the cemeteries being chic? So again, the title plays a game, but you are seeing Christ both at the beginning of his life with his mother and also at the end of his life carrying the cross. Catholic iconography appears all over my work. I'm certainly not Catholic, but Catholicism produced an awful lot of very great painting in Europe through the last 400 years, and it's just built into art history, and I love art history, so that's why it appears. Plus the story of Christ, which I do not take literally, is a rather good story. It has a lot to teach us if we properly listen to it.
So there is this extraordinary yellow paint in there. Can you tell me about that?
It's the yellow paint that Christ mostly is painted in it, and Mary's hand as well. It draws your eye into the centre of the work, and it's Indian yellow, which is one of my favourite colours because it's made in India, I presume still, from ox's urine, which is left in pans to evaporate in the sun, and the residue is further ground up to make Indian yellow, and I just love the idea of painting with ox's wee. It's like bone black. It's sort of the idea of painting with black paint that's made from burnt bones. It just has a nice feel to it. Especially with this subject matter. It's earthy. It's an earthy colour. It's a yellow which is warm, but it's also slightly green, strangely, as well. It's a very enigmatic colour, I think. It's a very thin paint. You can't really build up colours very well in it, but it's fantastic for glazing. It lacks opacity. Over the years, you just find out which paints are good for certain things. Sort of talking to other artists and being lectured to over the years has taught me a great deal.
That's interesting. I didn't think that sort of thing was taught very much anymore.
Well, it's not, and it's kind of quite good it's not in many ways, because artists can get a little bit obsessed with the sort of technical details, and I think it's quite nice, the idea as a conceptual artist, you don't have to worry about those things too much, but they're still important, because when it comes down to it, what you're looking at needs to be beautifully made, and as an artist I think you need to have control over what you do. The frame, by the way, it's a very strange frame because it's probably a mashup of different frames, all Italian. A lot of my work, the starting point is an antique frame, In this case, it's a 17th century Italian frame, but there are some French and German and English frames in there too. And I like the idea of the frame controlling the size that the work is going to be, but also the feel of the movement of the frame and the colour of the frame changes my painting. So I'm working along with the frame and creating a work. The frame is an integral part of the work now because the very gestures I've used borrow elements from the frame. That's not the way round art's supposed to be. You're supposed to make a painting and then it's put in a frame, or mostly not put in a frame actually these days. But if you're not supposed to do something, of course, it's the first thing I want to do, being difficult.
We'll look at an exhibition that you did in Florence at a museum which has a collection of frames. But is there in the back of your mind, when you look at a frame, the kind of paintings that usually hang in frames like that?
It's difficult because I'm making work for an audience, so I'm not making work just for myself. So I know an awful lot about frames now. I've learned it over the past few years since the show at the Museo Stefano Bardini in Florence that you referred to, that started me on this process of making drawings and paintings for antique frames. In many cases in the 17th, 18th century, the frame would have been far more expensive than the actual work inside it, just because far more work was put into the gilding and the carving of the frame than the actual painting, and gilders and carvers were paid more than painters were. But the audience doesn't really know or need to know about the history of frames. So a lot of it is genuinely what I feel the frame feels like. I may know the actual history of it and where it comes from and what sort of work would have tended to be put in these frames, but I'm perfectly happy to break the rules, to just say, right, this work has travelled through 300 years of history and it's now in the 21st century and it means something completely different than it did when it was actually made. So let's play some games with a contemporary audience. I don't want to be obsessed with art history too much.
Let's talk about this different kind of work. I'm not sure whether it's a painting or a sculpture or both.
Well, I get mixed up because I'm never sure whether to call it a painting or a sculpture, because most of what you see there is actually oil paint. There is an acrylic base, acrylic paint underneath, because it's more structurally rigid. And oil paint does have its limits because it won't stay upright, but there is still a lot of oil paint applied with a brush, all with the same size brush all over, which is a little trick I've learned from Frank Auerbach, that if you make a painting and just use the same brush, and it gives it a certain unified feel, which gives this a rather nice sense of movement over the top of the whole thing. But the starting point is a French early 19th century sculpture that would have been made en masse for people on their European tour. Gentlemen would have collected these sculptures and put them with their collection of other tour memorabilia. So it's not a sculpture of any great value. I'm not trying to take something and then destroy it. I'm trying to augment it. And certainly in this case with Damp Stars, you see an awful lot of the bronze sculpture. In some cases, the bronze sculpture is almost completely, or sometimes absolutely completely covered up by the time I've finished. But in this case, just her arm, which is reaching up, becomes covered and extended into this grotesque lump of paint which appears to be floating above her. The colour in this actually comes from a rather beautiful Degas painting, which is in pastel. Degas had a very peculiar colour sensibility. He put purples and blues and greens together in an extraordinary way that makes you feel rather uncomfortable and awkward, but somehow is beautiful as well. And in a lot of my paintings and in sculptures too, there will be colour from another artist that I draw upon. It's a starting point.
That leads me to this work here, which you painted for an exhibition, I believe, at the Musée National Eugène Delacroix in Paris. And Delacroix was a great colourist, wasn't he? He talked about colour theory, didn't he, and putting different colours next to each other, because I have noticed that colour is hugely important in your work.
One of the interesting things about doing the exhibition is that his studio was painted bright red. And if you look at a lot of his paintings, there'll be a nude figure or a figure standing in a room, and there's this red glow on the side of them that when you go to his studio, you realise where the red glow is coming from. But he utilises this to give his figures a little bit more three-dimensionality and a little bit more feeling and warmth. Delacroix's paintings can be quite dark, but there can be quite sharp points of sort of blues and greens and reds just coming in to enliven things. So yes, he has a very particular colour sensibility. Quite a number of works in the exhibition were directly after Delacroix, but this one is after another French artist, Boucher, and the starting point is very much the frame, and the Boucher drawing inside it becomes a sort of extension almost of the frame, where the lines are starting to go for a walk and turn into this sort of abstract shape. One of the things I like about working with a frame is that it's an absolute challenge. How can I make something which is going to overpower this very, very dominant frame? And it's just a game to play.
It works beautifully. It has a sort of balance to it, which is just perfect.
Well, in order to overpower something, you have to work in harmony with it as well. You have to be similar enough to it not to be jarring, and you have to be slightly subservient in certain ways, and I take some of the colours from the frame, but then you have to be more enigmatic than the frame in many ways. Basically, the greater puzzle is what on earth you're looking at in the middle of the frame rather than the frame itself. I've made a number of works for particular museums. I did an exhibition in Amsterdam at Rembrandt Studio as well, which was a wonderful thing to do because I had 2 years' notice, and therefore I could just make work specifically for the exhibition. It pushes me to do things that I wouldn't normally do. It's very nice to be tested. It just makes life more enticing.
Is this a drawing or a painting? And did you do it on yellow paper? Because in the Renaissance, many draftsmen started drawing, and actually in the 18th century as well. Somebody like Boucher might have done drawings on pink paper or on different coloured papers.
It is. It's actually not on paper, but polyester film. I do drawings on paper as well, but polyester film, which is a drafting film, just has such a beautiful smooth surface, and I apply the paint onto it with a very fine brush, and it just flows over the surface in a very nice way, and I can make very nice long lines. I sort of call it a drawing, even though it's done with a paintbrush. Actually, surprisingly, the colour on the background was put on after quite a bit of the drawing was done, because you can do the drawing, and then because it's translucent film, you can paint the back of it, which then changes the colour. So it's a bit of an odd way round of working, that you can put the ground on after you've done the drawing. But again, it just allows me a bit of flexibility. Whether it's a drawing or whether it's a painting, I don't know. It is a lot of my work shifts between both, just as, is it a sculpture or is it a painting? I sort of like to make things that are slightly between 2 points.
You did a little film on your website about Odilon Redon and how much you liked his work. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that on the painting Closed Eyes and how it impacted on your work.
Yeah, I was asked to do a little talk for a video by the Musée d'Orsay in Paris just before lockdown. And I had the whole wonderful museum to pick any work I wanted. It was a difficult choice, but this painting by Odilon Redon was one that I'd always held dear. It's a very small work, but it's so enigmatic and so powerful, and to me seems monumental. I love it because it just asks lots of questions. First of all, is it a figure of a man or is it a woman? And are they in water or are they behind something? And what scale are they? There's something about the painting, about the perspective in the painting, which makes the head look absolutely monumental, as if it could be a mountain, but also it could just be head size as well. And the idea of looking at a figure with its eyes closed, and therefore are they aware that you're looking at them? So there becomes this strange feeling that you have as in, am I supposed to be looking at this person? And that idea of having a portrait of somebody who's actually not specific. The Impressionists and the Expressionists used the idea of blanking out the eyes in a figure. If you look at a lot of Picasso's paintings or Matisse's paintings or Cézanne's paintings, you'll see that there's no pupils, especially with Picasso. He doesn't want you to look at Maria Theresa or whoever he was painting. He wants you to look at Picasso. He wants you to look at the way the painting's made, not what particularly the painting is of. And that's what happens when you can't engage with the person's eyes. I mean, I suppose it's something we've learned, especially over the last 2 years, how important somebody's eyes are, because if you've been wearing a face mask and having a conversation, you realise that your eyes have an awful lot of expression in them. And if you have sunglasses on or having a conversation with somebody that you can't see their eyes, it's actually really difficult to gauge quite the nuance of what they're talking about. It's exactly the same with the painting. Whether you've got your eyes closed or not, it's sort of, you have a very different relationship if you can't see the eyes. The person could have them closed and they could be dreaming and not thinking of you at all, which I think is what's happening in this painting.
And it also points you to the inner soul, doesn't it? And to a sort of sense of otherworldliness or lack of physical presence.
Yes, there's a translucency to the way that the work is made. I mean, this is oil on canvas, but an awful lot of the work that Rembrandt did was actually pastel, which was perfect medium for him because there's a translucent softness to it, which makes the paintings appear to be sort of apparitions. They're another world. He was a symbolist fundamentally, though he was working surrounded by all of the great Impressionist artists. But whereas the Impressionists were very much interested in the real world and depicting railways and mountains and seascapes that really existed and you felt like you were there, Rembrandt wasn't interested in the real world. He was interested in this inner symbolist world of the dream, and in that sense had far more to do with the surrealists that would come another sort of 40 years later. It has a beautiful soft translucency, which again I try and borrow from him in an awful lot of my works. In the drawing you have next to it, Get It On, there's two paintings by the French 19th century artist Gruet. They're overlaid, so you can't quite tell where one face starts and where one finishes. It's as if there's two emotions in one. It almost becomes cartoon-like, and it's as if the sort of head is shifting from one perspective to another sort of instantaneously. It's almost a sort of cubist work because it has that cubist sense of seeing the world from different perspectives.
Shall we talk about another work which you produced for the Delacroix exhibition, which refers to a Delacroix study?
Yes, and certainly in the original by Delacroix, the sort of reds and pinks are rather highlighted in a way that you can imagine that was painted in a red room. It's a very ghoulish painting, this. The figure has no head, so the breasts become like two eyes, because I wanted there to be a certain surrealist twist. But the whole figure is painted with these sort of translucent blue-green colours. You can almost see through it, or into it anyway. So it appears to be this apparition in this non-space of a background. The title, which is in German, is The Mother of the Artist, a bit of a sort of tongue-in-cheek reference to my wonderful mother.
And of course, in the tradition of Whistler's mother.
Absolutely, yes. Whistler's mother.
And Dürer's mother.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I've never shown the painting to my mother. But she would probably laugh if she saw it. In fact, I know she would laugh if she saw it. If you notice in the painting, there's a scar just in the side of the belly. There's a hole. So it appears like Christ on the cross, where he's been stabbed in the side. But also on the finger, which the figure is holding out, there's blood, dripping blood. So it appears that she is both Christ and doubting Thomas, that she has stuck her finger in the wound and is now showing the blood to you in a sort of accusatory way, saying, look what you've done. It's quite a dark emotional painting as well. So when I say tongue-in-cheek, it's not meant to be just funny, it's meant to be rather tragic as well.
I like that about your paintings. A lot of them do that. They play on both sides, which I think always makes for the best work.
Well, it's the true nature of the grotesque, really. The idea of the grotesque goes right back to Roman art and Greek art. They create fantastical figures and animals which are both funny and humorous, but also dangerous looking, and a place that you both want to visit and a place you definitely don't want to be. It's just like Carnival, really, or the Day of the Dead. It's both. You laugh at death and you laugh at tragedy. I think they're very important ways of presenting the world.
For all we've talked about colour, now this one is what we would call a grisaille, and so done in monochrome.
Yes, the original painting, which I saw in Rome, is by Mancini. It's a beautiful mid-18th century Baroque painting where the colour is absolutely dominant in it. And like many Baroque paintings, the colour is not really very naturalistic. Well, it's not a naturalistic scene. And I was fascinated by the brushstrokes. It's not a very large painting, this. It's only about 40 centimetres tall, maybe. Whereas my painting is getting near 3 metres tall. For me, it's a very big painting. So I realise people make larger ones still, but for me, that's a lot of work. Because as in all of my works, the surface is deadly flat. Brushstrokes that you appear to see are painted painstakingly. They're not just one mark made with a brush. So all of my work takes a very long time to make. I sort of make about 5 or 6 paintings a year. But that's a lot of time put into making those 5 or 6 paintings. So in this, the brushstrokes are very dominant, and figures that in the original are slightly clearer to read become more abstracted in that faces are distorted in my work, even more than the original, because it's a sketch, the original. It is quite distorted anyway. When you see mine, at first you might not even recognise what on earth you're looking at. You don't see Christ in the middle and Mary, and you don't see the angel and the the saint on the left, you just see this abstract mass of grey brushstrokes. And it's only when you sort of get much further back from the painting you start to see the figures. So my work tends not to work very well in translation on computers or in books. They're not very Instagram friendly. I really make paintings that I want people to see in the real world. Paint itself is such a wonderful technology and has such wonderful qualities that don't translate. Why, as a painter, why would I choose to ignore all those wonderful qualities it had and just make bland paintings you are meant to see from a distance or on a photograph? I think painting's too important for that.
Where does this hang today? Is it in a gallery or is it in a private collection, or have you still got it in your studio?
It's in a private collection in San Francisco, and I don't know where it hangs. Unfortunately, that's what happens to an awful lot of the paintings. They end up, or maybe fortunately, they end up in somebody else's house or somebody's collection somewhere, and hopefully they go on display and don't just end up in a crate in a warehouse somewhere, which I think is very sad. I think it's very important for people to go out and actually go to museums and go to galleries and see work in the flesh rather than just sitting at home, which I know we've been forced to do, but now you're able to get out, go and see exhibitions in private galleries and in museums, because they're a fantastic resource. You have some great surprises, seeing things that you didn't expect to see.
Where's your next big exhibition going to be for people that would like to go and see your works in the flesh?
In New York at Gagosian Gallery in October. So at the moment I'm making work for that. And then after that, the beginning of next year, I'll have a show in 2 museums in Hanover. But I'm also, at some point this year, I don't know when, I'll be opening a space in London to show my own work, because I've been so frustrated by the fact that even though my work is in some public collections in London, it doesn't get shown, that I'm going to show it to the public myself. So it's a completely non-commercial, completely free space in the middle of London that people will be able to see my work, and maybe the work of some other artists as well, but predominantly mine.
We'd be very happy to shout it out. There are many other paintings that we could talk about, but let's talk about the Baroque. Because you talk about the Baroque, particularly in relation to nature and to your feelings for nature and your concerns.
Yes, I mean, my understanding of the world is that mankind has hit a particular point where we've been fighting with our planet for far too long, and we need to succumb to how important and how delicate the world is. We have to work in harmony with it rather than fighting and degrading it. And therefore, Baroque is very interesting in that the sense of movement and imbalance that Baroque has is very important. Nothing has to be perfect. Nothing has to have a perfect symmetry. Nothing has to have perfectly straight lines. You work with the elements that you have. And in this drawing, after Grimaldi and Gouet, you have a figure in a tree, which you could see as being neoclassical, or you also could see as referring to European folklore of the green man, or the figure in the tree, or the wood spirit, or the nymph. The face is both appearing and disappearing in this rather sort of asymmetrical, slightly awkward tree. And it's an idea of loneliness. And it's an idea of this head which sort of appears in the spirit world and then maybe disappears again in this dreamlike state. It's a very detailed little drawing, this. Lots of little chaotic lines, creating lots of little tiny curves. In many ways, a sort of neoclassical and then modernist idea of straight line and man dominating nature, I think, has to come to an end and make way for a much softer Baroque idea of architecture and industry, that we can be more sympathetic to each other and to the world.
I think that's a really lovely place to end, Glenn. It's just been so interesting to hear from you about how you make these things and what you're thinking about when you make them. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.